The screen flickered, illuminating a face smeared with dried, rust-colored blood. Captain Lyra Voss did not look like a conqueror. She wore a faded red scarf tied firmly at her left wrist, a remnant of a battle she had survived. Behind her, the bridge of the cargo hauler Steadfast sparked with exposed wiring and venting steam, yet she was the one offering terms. Across the void, War Chief Draken stared at the communication feed. His bioluminescent mandibles, usually flared crimson with the thrill of the hunt, dimmed to a pale, shocked blue. Around his flagship, the wreckage of his hunter fleet drifted in silent, burning chunks. I thought I knew what predators looked like, until I saw what humans hid in the dark. 2 weeks earlier, the shattered veil had been nothing more than a severe navigational hazard. The veil was a graveyard of ambition. Millions of tons of twisted metal, shattered silicate and hollowed-out station husks formed a dense, spinning ring around a dead star. Navigational computers hated the sector. It was the perfect place to hide. Lyra stood on that same bridge, holding a plain steel flask dented heavily on one side. The coffee inside was bitter and strong, exactly the way survival tasted. The rule was absolute on her ship. Coffee first, crisis second. Outside the reinforced viewport, the debris field of a forgotten war spun in slow, jagged orbits. Engines pushing 110%, Captain, Marcus Webb muttered from the engineering console. His thick beard twitched with nervous energy. She is a cargo hauler, not a racing star. She will complain the whole way. Lyra meticulously screwed the cap back onto the steel flask. Let her complain, Marcus. We will be alive to hear it. The digital cargo manifest listed agricultural supplies and hydroponic filters. Down in the lower hold, the physical labels on the heavy gray steel crates read, "Property of Terran Colonial Defense." The trap required immense patience. For 14 days, the 12 crew members of the Steadfast had seeded the jagged perimeter of the veil. They disguised dormant military seeker mines as hollowed-out salvage, matching the thermal signature of cold iron to perfection. Then, they waited in the dark for the apex predators to notice them. When the proximity alarms finally screamed, they sounded exactly like bait. 5 Vor warships dropped out of warp on the edge of the sector. They were brutal, jagged constructions. Their hulls were grown from the armor of subdued targets and armed with kinetic harpoons that could punch through a small moonlet. At their center hung the Iron Maw, Draken's massive flagship, casting a long, predatory shadow across the starlight. "Contact," Kira Tan said softly from the helm. The 25-year-old former atmospheric pilot kept her hands entirely steady on the yoke. 5 bogies, heavy armor profiles. They are accelerating toward our position. "Cut the primary drive," Lyra ordered. "Give them the distress profile. Dump the excess plasma from the tertiary vents to make it look authentic." The Steadfast shuddered violently. Internal lights flickered and died, replaced by the sickly amber of emergency backup generators. A thick cloud of ionized gas vented from the aft quarters, simulating a catastrophic engine failure. To the sensors of the approaching hunter fleet, the civilian freighter had just blown a gasket under the stress of pursuit. It drifted helplessly toward the dense, spinning edge of the debris field. A transmission punched through the static. Guttural clicks and deep, resonant growls translated into a mechanical voice on the bridge. "Vessel Steadfast, you are claimed. Power down remaining systems and prepare for boarding. Resistance guarantees harvest." Lyra ignored the open channel. She checked the tactical display. The Vor formation remained tight and arrogant. They relied on a 3-generation legacy of galactic dominance. Predators simply did not expect sheep to bite back. "Distance to Alpha perimeter?" she asked. 4,000 kilometers, Kira replied. "They are sending 2 scout interceptors ahead to secure our flanks." "Let them cross the line." The 2 Vor scouts burned hard, their thrusters glowing violent purple against the black. They crossed the invisible boundary of the seeded wreckage. Inside the starboard scout, a young striker named Vok tightened his grip on a kinetic boarding pike, eager for his first harvest. He never made it to the airlock. "Wake them up," Lyra said. Marcus tapped a single, unmarked physical switch on his console. Deep in the floating graveyard, the salvage woke up. The silent, blinding white flash of detonating seeker mines erased the shadows. There was no sound in the vacuum, only a furious expansion of thermal energy that instantly vaporized the portside shields of both scout vessels. Secondary explosions ripped through their magazines. 3 seconds. That was all it took for the interceptors to become expanding clouds of molten slag. On the main screen, the Iron Maw abruptly halted its advance. "They are confused," Lyra noted, her voice completely flat. "They think it was a navigational hazard. They do not recognize a minefield." "Main fleet is locking targeting lasers on us," Marcus warned. 3 remaining ships, they are mad." "Raise the curtain." The Steadfast dropped its helpless act. The hull plating along the port cargo bay retracted mechanically. There were no standard laser batteries underneath. Instead, heavy mining lasers, usually reserved for cracking open dense asteroids, tracked outward. Marcus had spent 2 months recalibrating the focusing lenses specifically for combat ranges. "Firing," Marcus grunted. Invisible beams of concentrated thermal energy lashed out. They did not pulse like military lasers. They sustained a continuous, burning pressure. The closest Vor warship tried to angle its shields, but the industrial equipment was designed to bore right through silicate and iron. The beam melted straight through the kinetic barrier and sliced off the ship's entire sensor array. The impact superheated the surrounding armor plating, glowing cherry red against the vacuum. The vessel spun out of formation, entirely blind and venting atmosphere. The freighter groaned under a sudden, violent impact. The deck plated pitched upward, throwing Lyra hard against her command chair. Sparks cascaded from the ceiling panels. "They harpooned us," Kira shouted over the blaring klaxons. "Physical tether established. They are reeling us in." "Let them pull," Lyra commanded. She unholstered a kinetic sidearm from her waist. "Seal the bridge. Depressurize the lower cargo corridors. Marcus, how are the rail guns?" "Loading the heavy slugs now," the engineer replied, his hands flying rapidly across the terminal. "Takes a minute to cycle the magnetic coils." Through the deck plating, a heavy, rhythmic scrape echoed. It was the distinct sound of Vor boarding pods magnetically locking onto the hull. The Predators had arrived. Down in the lower corridors, the lights were already gone. Sarah Chen, the medical officer, knelt behind a stack of steel crates holding a customized pulse rifle. Her magnetic boots anchored her firmly to the deck plating. She breathed slowly, matching her rhythm to the flashing amber emergency lights. Dust motes floated lazily in the microgravity. The outer airlock blew inward. Decompression sucked the loose debris out into the void before the emergency bulkhead slammed shut, sealing the section. 4 Vor warriors poured into the zero-gravity corridor. They were massive, measuring over 2 meters at the shoulder, propelled by 4 powerful limbs encased in thick chitin. Their bioluminescent mandibles glowed predatory red in the dark, but the corridors of the Steadfast were built for humans. The tight angles restricted the quadrupeds, forcing them to crouch awkwardly and limiting their lethal leaping strikes. Sarah fired 2 precise bursts. The rounds pinged off the lead warrior's armor, failing to penetrate, but the kinetic force sent the massive alien spinning wildly in the zero-G environment. A magnetic grenade, rolled perfectly by an unseen crewmate from an adjoining vent, clamped firmly onto the warrior's chest plate. The detonation deafened the corridor. Up on the bridge, the tactical screen flashed red as life signs extinguished below. "Borders neutralized or contained," Sarah reported through the comms. Her voice held absolute clinical detachment. 2 captured, treating their injuries now. "Copy that, Doc," Marcus said. He turned to Lyra. Rail guns are cycled. Target is the tether ship. Fire. The cargo launch system, heavily modified to shoot solid iron slugs at a fraction of light speed, slammed backward with concussive force. The unguided slug bypassed the Vor shields entirely and punched a neat, terrible hole completely through the second warship's engine block. The physical tether snapped. The damaged vessel drifted away, completely dead in the water. Only the Iron Maw remained. War Chief Draken's flagship was massive, bristling with heavy plasma batteries. It surged forward, abandoning caution, determined to crush the tiny freighter through sheer mass alone. Plasma fire washed over the Steadfast's forward deflector shields. The ambient temperature on the bridge spiked instantly. "Shields at 20%, Kira yelled. "We cannot take another volley like that." Lyra did not blink. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the dented steel flask. She deliberately, methodically unscrewed the cap, taking a very slow sip. The bitter, metallic taste grounded her in the moment. "Marcus," Lyra said softly, "open the containers." "Drones are locked," Marcus replied, wiping thick sweat from his forehead. "Well, mostly locked on target." "Launching." The false panels on the exterior cargo bays blew outward, shedding large sheets of deceptive metal. 20 military-grade seeker drones deployed into the void. They were not human-piloted. They were an autonomous swarm, terrifyingly efficient, leftover hardware from the colony wars. They moved like a school of predatory fish, dodging the Iron Maw's heavy plasma fire with mathematical perfection. Each drone was barely the size of a torpedo, painted high-visibility orange, heavily scarred from previous engagements. They did not target the thickest armor. They systematically dismantled the ship's external weapon nodes, communication arrays, and maneuvering thrusters. They latched onto the cooling vents, detonating shaped charges that forced the massive cannons to overheat and melt from the inside out. Sparks showered the void. Secondary internal explosions registered on the tactical scanners, confirming the systematic destruction of the alien ship's offensive grid. Within 40 seconds, the apex predator was completely disabled. It floated in the dark, heavily armored but utterly incapable of fighting or maneuvering. The debris field grew quiet. Lyra tapped the communication console. The screen flickered, returning to the moment that had begun it all. The face of the cargo captain, smeared with dried blood from a blown console, stared down the war chief. "You should have let us pass," Lyra said. It was not a threat. It was a simple, devastating fact. Behind her, the bridge of the freighter smelled of burnt ozone and recycled sweat. Behind Draken, the massive command center of the Iron Maw was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the frantic flashing of damage reports. Draken's mandibles twitched. The pale blue of profound shock slowly gave way to a rigid, trembling stillness. 3 generations of his lineage had never surrendered. The genetic taboo against retreating from a lesser target burned intensely in his blood. His clawed hand hovered over his command console. He reached toward the manual override for his ship's self-destruct core. Death was preferable to humiliation. "We are not prey," Lyra said, her voice cutting sharply through the heavy silence. "We are humans, remember that." Draken froze. "You have one chance," she continued, her eyes locking onto his. "Power down your core. Drop your internal blast doors. Leave your weapons offline. If you do this, you live." The warlord's breathing grew shallow. He looked at the human. He looked at the red scarf tied at her wrist, recognizing a remnant of a battle she had survived. He realized then that the civilian disguise was not deception. It was a choice about when to unleash war. He pulled his hand away from the self-destruct console. Slowly, agonizingly, Draken tapped the command to officially lower his ship's weapons. The channel closed. The void reasserted itself. Lyra turned to Marcus. "Now comes the hard part. We rescue the survivors." Down in the medical bay, a young Vor warrior, his shattered arm wrapped tightly in human bandages, looked up at Sarah Chen. "Why?" he rasped. "Why not finish the kill?" The rescue operations took 6 exhaustive hours. Lifeboats were dragged carefully from the wreckage. 43 Vor survivors, including warriors who had tried to tear the hull apart with their bare claws, were brought aboard the Steadfast. Sarah Chen moved among them with quiet efficiency. "Because you are hurt," she answered the young warrior simply. "That is reason enough." Draken remained on his crippled flagship, watching the sensor feeds in total silence. Lyra had left him with life support and a functioning distress beacon. He understood the human strategy now. Real power was choosing mercy when vengeance was entirely justified. He was being left alive not out of weakness, but to serve as a messenger. He would return to the Vor hierarchy and tell them exactly what lurked beneath the frail exterior of human merchant ships. 3 days later, the Steadfast limped into Haven Terminal. The low, vibrating hum of its overtaxed engines echoed through the massive docking bay, a mechanical complaint that Marcus had predicted perfectly. The hull was scorched black, venting trace amounts of coolant. A massive crowd gathered behind the security cordons as the primary ramp lowered. Customs officials stared in stunned silence. Under heavily armed human escort, the 43 alien predators filed out, alive. The whispers began immediately, spreading rapidly across the station network, carrying the heavy weight of a shifted balance. On the quiet bridge, Lyra Voss stood alone. She looked out the viewport at the sprawling, crowded station. She lifted the dented steel flask to her lips. The coffee was still bitter,